the first topic we decided to talk about was even before Charlie Kirk was murdered. We thought it would be great to start by rethinking the state, the role of the state in our societies, and that obviously has taken another dimension now with what has happened in America, which has shaken the whole world, and so it's a perfect time to really talk about that. So the theme is, how did we get there, the modern Nordic state? So you're all from the Nordic nations. The little example that I'm gonna tell you will mainly serve those who will watch who are not from the Nordic nations. But a few years ago, my wife, Elina, was at the hospital with our youngest daughter when she was diagnosed with diabetes. And at some point, she realized that quite a few of the services there were given for free. And so she said to the nurse, well, that's really great that we can have this for free. And the nurse raised her arms in the air and thought that she would start praising. And she did start praising by saying, well, we have to thank the state for that. And so you can see a bit the situation. Well, this is, I believe, a picture that represents quite well the situation in our Nordic nations today. The state has taken a position of God, nearly. It's a God-like position that is taken for granted by the overwhelming majority of the people in the Nordic nations. It's taken for granted that the state should take care of us, should provide for our healthcare, for our welfare, for our education, the education of our children. That's the responsibility of the state. That's the idea that is very well upheld in our nations today. And so this mode of organizing our nations, as I said, it seems to be the only one that is possible in the mind of the Nordic man. There's no alternative presented. It's either that or anarchy. But yet, tonight we want to look at the fact that the Bible teaches us another way. And in fact, the Nordic nations have not always been functioning in such a way, that in the way they are today. And we didn't reach this place just by default, by just the process of history. There's kind of this invisible hand of that makes history go. That's not the way it happened. Things happened in history, very specific things that happened in history that led to this actual view of the state. But let's get back a few centuries, even millennia before us, even before Jesus came on earth. And if we look back at the ancient pagan empires, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and even Rome, there was one common factor. And that factor is that, well, people worshipped all kinds of gods. You know, there were regional gods. There was the god for agriculture, and even within agriculture, there were different gods according to what you were cultivating, and so on and so forth. But over all of that, the supreme god was to be worshipped by all, was the emperor. There was no exception. Everyone had to worship the emperor. The emperor was the living God, was God walking on earth. And he would not tolerate any other god above him or even equal to him. There could be other gods under him, but not equal to him. And this is why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fire, or even Daniel in the time of Persia was thrown into the lion's den. And of course, many Christians in the Christian era have been martyred, in particular in ancient Rome. And all these cases, in fact, in all these cases, the Christians, before or after, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, were persecuted because they refused to bow to the human ruler as if he was God. They recognized there was the true God, and that they could not bow down to the political God. So over and against this pagan view of the state, we have the biblical view. Many people today would say that the Bible has nothing to say about politics. Many Christians believe that. Many would say that Jesus never talked about politics, but that would be, there's nothing further from the truth. In fact, this is missing one of the most fundamental statements that Jesus ever said. When Peter confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus said, and I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now, the word church is so common in our languages in the North. We have all like kirk, or kirkko in Finnish. It's so common that we don't even think about the term itself. And we really don't understand what Jesus was meaning back then. The fact is that the Greek word ecclesia translates as people called out. But it was the same word that was used to describe the society living under one ruler, under one emperor. So it was a political term, ecclesia. The society of the Roman Empire was the ecclesia under the emperor. And so Jesus' statement is strongly political. It has a lot of political meaning into the term ecclesia. But the Bible teaches us a very specific vision of society. And it's a vision that began to spread as soon as Christianity began to come to Europe, even though it's always been, it's most of the time been upheld imperfectly. And from this point, I just would like to say that the Nordic model of the state is in fact, the modern Nordic model of the state is in fact a fruit of such misinterpretation of biblical teachings. That's what we're going to look at in this short presentation. But first, I want to just play out here the biblical vision for a Christian nation. It's very simple. Firstly, God is sovereign. Jesus is sovereign. He before he went to heaven, he was ascended next to the Father. In fact, he said that all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. He rules today. He is sovereign. And so when we talk about Christian nation, it's not like we decide that Jesus is going to be our God. Jesus is already God. Jesus is already sovereign. What we have is nations that recognize his sovereignty, that would be called a Christian nation, or that rebels against this sovereignty. But there's no such thing as that we can democratically choose whether we're going to have Jesus as our God or not. Jesus rules already now. So this is a crucial step. And if that's the case, then Jesus is sovereign over all spheres of life, including the state. So there is no way that we can get away from the almighty state if we don't first recognize that Jesus is sovereign. And this was in fact recognized in the Nordic nations, as you all know, for more or less 1,000 years, depending on the nation. And secondly, well, if Jesus is sovereign, then his law must prevail over the law of man. The Ten Commandments and their application cannot be overruled by men. This too was a recognized fact in all the Nordic nations for about a millennium. It sounds as a surprise for the modern man today, but this was the case in spite of the fact that it was sometimes badly interpreted or badly understood. Just as an example of how badly understood it could be, in Norway, the first Christian law of Norway ordered that children born out of wedlock should be executed because, of course, only marriage should have children. So, well, there was a bit of a misunderstanding of the law of God, but okay, we made progress ever since. And progressively, in particular after the Reformation, the laws of the Nordic nations became more aligned with the law of God. And so, for example, the King of Sweden declared specifically that the law of Sweden will be the law of God in 1602. That was the beginning of the era known as it was called Lex Dei Politica, the politics of the law of God. And thirdly, so first, Jesus is sovereign. Second, the law of God should be the law of the nation. And thirdly, the Bible teaches that there are three estates or three governments, three forms of governments. That's the big difference with the modern pagan state, that we have only one government. That's the state that rules over everything. That's a pagan view. That was the pagan view in the past, and it's the pagan view today. But in a Christian order, in a biblical order, there are three governments under the sovereign rule of Christ. So they all directly are accountable to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so the Christian nation must recognize that there are three governments. They are all derivative of his supreme rule. And these governments are, of course, there is the state, but there's also the family and the church. Now, I don't, there's nothing new, of course, for those of you who are Christians from even a long time. This is nothing new, but this view of the Christian nation began to spread right from the Catholic era in Europe. This idea of three estates spread before the Reformation, in fact. It started already with the early church. And that's why I want to run through a bit through the history. The idea that there were three estates in a society governed by God. So, as I said, began to spread very quickly in the early times of Christendom. Medieval literature, most famously, the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, shows that it was understood that there were three estates. He was talking about three estates already in that book. And there were, basically, these three estates were understood like this in Roman Catholic time. There's those who work, those who fight, and those who pray. So there's those who work, that's the family. Those who fight, that is those who defend also, that's the state. And then those who pray, these are the monks and the priests. But that was Roman Catholic times. And so Martin Luther taught the same subdivision, and it was understood by all. He didn't need to explain very much, these three estates as if it was something new. It was already understood by all Europeans at the time. But he used Latin words, politicus, economicus, and ecclesiasticus. The politicus, of course, is the state. Economicus, that's those who work, the family, that's the source of prosperity in a nation, is the family, and ecclesiasticus. But contrary to his Roman Catholic predecessors, he got rid of some Greek ideas. The Roman Catholic era was strongly shaped by Greek thinking, in particular Aristotelian thinking, and which believed that you can go up and down within the same box, whether you are among those who pray or those who are fighting, for example. You could go up or down the ladder, just as Aristotle taught. So he got rid of that. And for him, those who pray could also be those who work. There could be people in two different boxes. That the Roman Catholic Church did not grant that, so that's why the priest could not be married. But after the Reformation, that began to change. So, but really, Luther never wrote specifically about the three estates. He never wrote any specific pamphlet on that. But it was everywhere in his writings. It could be seen. Now we could also talk about Luther's teaching of the two kingdoms. And this has been a teaching that has been so misunderstood over time. But the idea was that there were two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of the church and the kingdom of what we would call the public square. And some have believed that Luther meant that the church was governed by the law of God, but that the public square was governed by common sense, by the laws, because God reveals himself in nature, and then therefore even the non-Christian can govern in the public square because he has the same revelation of God that we have through nature. But that was not what Luther understood. Luther understood, and it was very clear in his writings, that the law of God must govern the state as well. There was absolutely no doubt about that. That was not what Luther had in mind, this division of two kingdoms, meaning two laws. That was not what he meant. And in fact, this two kingdom theology has gone through the times in the Lutheran Church, and also actually come from a more Calvinistic background. And there is this two kingdom theology also upheld by Calvinists even today. But if it is true, let's just think a little bit. Let's just pause a little bit here. If it is true that because God reveals himself in nature, then therefore we don't need the law of God to govern the state. Well, can I see in nature the commandment, thou shalt not steal? Now, if I go to the forest, I spend the day in the forest, and I will see birds eating worms, or I see a lot of killing in nature. It doesn't come. I can't take for granted through God's revelation in nature that killing is wrong. If we are highly evolved animals, like we are considered to be right now by the modern evolutionary instinct thought, and I look at nature around me, it's absolutely not taken for granted. I mean, if the animals kill each other, why not mankind? So this two kingdoms, of course, and I know that these theological discussions are a bit more developed than what I just said, but in practice, really, the Luther could not have meant that just the revelation of God in nature is enough to govern the public square, that is the state in particular. But let's return to history. Luther's doctrine of the three estates was later taught and deepened by German Lutheran scholars. Philipp Melanchthon expanded on that, and Matthias Affenreffer, for those who know a bit of the German Lutheran history. In the 17th century, the doctrine of the three estates was still upheld. It was really understood here in the two main kingdoms of the Nordic nations, that is Denmark and Sweden. So, of course, that meant also Norway, Iceland, Finland, even Estonia, because they were part either of Denmark or Sweden. Well, but this doctrine of three estates was never really upheld very well. In Roman Catholic Europe, you had the three estates. The Roman Catholic Church would teach that, but the Pope was seen as above all of them. So the Pope is ruling the church, but the Pope is also above the king and is above the family. So somehow the Pope overlooks them all. At least that was the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. We could think that in the Nordic nations, because they went away from the Roman Catholic Church, this kind of teaching was therefore better upheld. But the sad thing is that was not the case. Of course, they didn't see the Pope as above that, but the king came to occupy such a place above these three governments. So the Bible teaches very clearly that the family, the state, and the church are directly accountable to God. We have Genesis 1 that establishes the family as directly accountable to God. Jesus says, I will build my church to Peter. That's a proof that it's directly accountable to God too. And of course, the state, where God gives the sword to the civil magistrate, Romans 13, another passage that shows that the state's directly accountable to God in their own, each one in their own specific sphere. But in the 1700s, in Sweden and Denmark, the king came to take the place of the Pope as an intermediate between the governments and God. In Denmark, for example, the law known as Kongelov, is that correct? The royal law, so I might not pronounce it well. It was adopted in 1661 and then enshrined in the Constitution of 1665. And the law recognized the principle of royal absolutism. And the church supported that. In fact, the Bishop of Sjælland, Zeeland, where Copenhagen is, Hans Vandal, wrote a book, 6 books called Juris Regi Libri, that is 6 books on the right of the majesty. And in that, he appeals to the kings of the Old Testament to justify the king's position above the three governments. Sweden took the same direction, in particular through the church law of 1686, so a bit later than Denmark, but just a couple of decades. And then the subsequent laws that were adopted in the 1690s. And according to the law, the king was obviously the ruler of the political arena, the state, but he was also seen as the church's first member. He was the first member of the church, so the wording was chosen. But in fact, in practice, he was ruling. He had the official right to appoint pastors in many parishes. And the clergy accepted this because in practice, the cathedral chapter were allowed to propose their candidates to the king. So the king was seen really as over these estates, these governments. And to get a glimpse of how the role of the king was perceived in the Nordic nations, let me just quote the words of the pastor of Santa Clara in Stockholm, beginning of 1700s, Simon Isogairus. And during a sermon shortly after a victory in the war, he said about Gustav XII, at the time was the king, that he is, I quote, God's anointed, earthly God, who is like a substitute of God on earth. So in Latin, the words used was vicarius Dei, the vicar of God. Now that's the exact same word that is used about the Pope in the Roman Catholic Europe. That was used in Lutheran Sweden. And so we had the position of, well, the king that was clearly established there in the minds of the people. When Finland was taken over by Russia, we get 100 years later, 1809, the very first deed that the estates gathered under Russia was in Porvoo, or Burgo in Swedish, a small town not so far from Helsinki today. It made it clear that the emperor would now be the supreme ruler over the Church of Finland, in spite of the fact that he was an Orthodox of the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, of course, the emperor was not sad about this situation. And moreover, that was the time of the Holy Alliance, which was in fact the spirit of that Holy Alliance between Prussia, Russia, and and Austria, where there was the alliance between the throne and the altar, and the emperor somehow was meant to uphold the Christian standards for the nation. So there had been some attempts to loosen the grip. It was not always really accepted that the king should be above everything. The nobles were not happy in Sweden many times. Sometimes you had a sort of parliamentary democracy that took place, but then sometimes the king took back more power, like Gustav III. Tried to bring back the rule under his thumb in Sweden at the end of the 1700s. But then in the 19th century, this was the era of nationalism, and the move towards parliamentary democracies could not be stopped. Of course, there had been the revolution in France, and in Denmark and Sweden, the king had to lower his expectations. It was not possible anymore to stay at that level. Well, today, this leads us to today. Now, of course, in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, we have kings. But we know that they don't rule the way they used to rule 200 years ago. That's not the case anymore. But I would like to suggest that this idea of the king ruling over these governments has not changed. The fact is that it's not the king as a person. So it's not Gustav in Sweden, for example, that rules over these three estates, but it is the state. The role of the king has been transferred to the state, because that's what parliamentary democracies are about. The state represents the majority, the majority voters, and so they have the right to enforce laws. But they are seen that role of the king has been transferred to the state, and that has been pretty much the same everywhere in the Nordic nations. So we see here the I would say wrong teaching from the Lutheran Reformation that came, and that finally set the state as the unchallenged ruler over all the governments, or over the three governments. But this alone would just not depict the correct full picture. As we know, 19th century saw the rise of many pagan philosophies, and I'm not going to go in details of all of that, and I have not even looked in detail in all the details how it happened, but just let me mention one philosopher in particular in Germany, who was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, it's not a coincidence that he lived in Lutheran Germany. Hegel didn't believe the God of Scripture, so there was no Jesus sovereign over the nations. For him, reason was the only real thing. So reason was supreme. And this led him to develop a political philosophy, which was famously known through one sentence, in which he said, "The state is the march of God on earth." So in other words, the state takes the place of Jesus. It's not Jesus who is sovereign over the nation, it's the state. And so it is no coincidence that service to the people, such as healthcare, welfare, or education, began to be transferred from the church to the state in the 19th century onwards. It was in line with Hegel's spirit. The fathers of Finland were Hegelian in their philosophy, such as Johann Wilhelm Snellman, for example. But such philosophy spread in Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark as well. So to summarize, the Lutheran doctrine of the three estates, with the king seen as above them all, and the 19th century shift from the king to the state, combined with Hegel's philosophy, are, I believe, what led our nations to have such a high view of the state and to basically not even challenge its position as being above the family or above the church. That's why we have state churches, not anymore in Sweden, but still in Finland, that is the case. So, of course, things have begun to shake a little bit since COVID, but still not quite as much as in other parts of Europe or even in America. And this leads me to conclude that this is the vision. I would like to conclude with the vision of Truth and Transformation Nordic. We all want to see a new Reformation triggered in our nations. And just like the 16th century Reformation, we believe that this new Reformation must have an impact in all spheres of life. And this is true politically as well. We believe that the biblical doctrine of the three estates must become central in our nations. We need to return to this correct interpretation of the three estates, three governments with their respective sphere of sovereignty. We want to build Christian nations, not in the nationalistic sense, that is, that the state would force the Christian faith on everyone. That is not the way Jesus taught us to spread the faith, but the state must recognize that Jesus is sovereign, because he is already today, and therefore his rule must be upheld. That was Luther's teaching, and in Calvinist lands also it was the teaching followed by the Puritans, and it was brought back, in fact, to the center by most notably Dutch neo-Calvinists like Abraham Kuyper in the 19th century in the Netherlands. In such nations, the role of the state was seen as very small, because the Bible doesn't require much from the state, as much as the pagan state is. The pagan state is growing all the time. It was more like what the libertarian political philosophers called the night watchman state, just there to uphold justice, to make sure that crime is being, like stealing or killing, is being correctly judged. And make sure that there is peace in the land. But healthcare, welfare, or education must return to the family and the church. That's where these spheres belong. The state must only take care of the police forces, the army, or the courts of justice. But of course, it is no use to appeal to history, because such Christian understanding of the nation has never really existed here in the North. And the attempts in England and America by the Puritans have been rather short-lived. But this is where the battle is raging today. We have forces that want more state control over all spheres of life. And these forces will never stop unless we stand for the gospel and its full implications for society. Now, I don't know what you think about the murder of Charlie Kirk, but the reason he was killed was not because he was a Christian nationalist, as we've heard being said, and with all sorts of negative connotations, whatever you believe, whatever you think about it. But the reason why he was killed, I believe, is precisely because he stood against the idea of the big state. And that's the threat to many modern pagan thinkers and those who are in fact seeing the nation only under these eyes. Someone who speaks against that cannot stand for them. And similar things are happening in Europe. Let's get out a bit think about these parties called far right. Now, they may have ideas that could be targeted as far right, but the fact is they often stand against the big state as well, the big state idea. Let me mention in Belgium, just in passing, a few weeks ago, a few weeks ago, There's a right-wing think tank named after Jean Gaulle. Jean Gaulle, you may probably not know him, but he was the leader of the right until the 1990s when he died. Never that party was qualified as far right. And yes, they organized an event to commemorate the 30 years of his death. And there was unrest in the street so that participants could not reach the room, and they were attacked by all sorts of left-wing groups and targeted as far right. So this is happening all over Europe, but the battle is right there, is that God is shaking this understanding of the big state. This is what's happening right now. The death of Charlie Kirk, these things with far-right parties and so on, and division that comes even within the church on that issue. It's precisely the shaking that God is bringing, and we must understand it. So how do we go about advancing such a project? Do we throw stones at the parliament and take weapons, start a rebellion, a revolution? Of course, we are not allowed to do that. Jesus told his disciples to teach the nations, not to take them by force. And we do it by persuasion, which must involve the preaching of the gospel. And for such a biblical model of nation, we need revival. There's no other way. But we need people with renewed minds and hearts. We also need to engage in a debate about how we should have our nations governed as well. But the idea that the Bible has nothing to say about politics is dead wrong. When Jesus said to Peter that on this rock he will build his church, he was making a strong political statement, as I said in the beginning. And so therefore, whether we believe it is possible to see our nations transformed or not, let me say that this is the direction of history, because God said that his kingdom will be established on earth as it is in heaven. He called us to pray that prayer. We pray it every Sunday. If you have a church which still prays the Lord's Prayer, you pray that his kingdom come. And so his kingdom is being implemented, even if we see retreat at the moment. God's kingdom will be fully implemented on earth as it is in heaven. It will be fully implemented in Denmark, in Estonia, in Finland, in Iceland, in Norway and Sweden, as it is in heaven. This is the right side of history, whether we see, even though we see some retreat in our nations at the moment, this is not the final word. The final word is that God's kingdom will be established on earth in the Nordic nations as it is in heaven. Well, thank you.